Brazil, the name itself conjures images of vibrant carnivals, sun-drenched beaches, and the beautiful game of football played with a rhythm all its own. It's a nation known for its warmth, its music, and its sprawling, irrepressible energy. But behind this familiar picture lies the shadow of a different Brazil. A Brazil of stark contrasts, of silent fear, and of a history that, for many, has been conveniently forgotten. This is the story of a time when the samba fell silent, replaced by the marching of boots. A 21-year period when Brazil was ruled by a military dictatorship. From 1964 to 1985, the country embarked on a path that was as astonishing as it was brutal. It was an era of unprecedented economic growth, a time of colossal construction projects that reshaped the face of the nation, a period hailed as the Brazilian miracle. But this miracle came at a staggering price. It was a time of darkness, a period known as the Years of Lead, where democracy was suspended, Congress was shut down, and basic human rights were systematically dismantled. It was an age where artists encoded rebellion in song lyrics, where journalists fought censorship with clever wordplay, and where thousands of citizens simply disappeared. How can a nation experience a golden age of progress and a dark age of repression at the very same time? This is the central paradox of Brazil's forgotten dictatorship. It is a story not just of generals and presidents, but of students, activists, and ordinary people who navigated a world where the promise of a prosperous future was built upon a foundation of fear. To understand modern Brazil, its triumphs, its inequalities, and its ongoing political struggles, we must first pull back the curtain on these dark years of progress. We will journey back to the coup that silenced a democracy witness, the rise of an economic powerhouse, feel the chill of the state's iron fist, and march with millions in the streets, who dared to demand their voices back. This is the story of how a nation lost its way, and how its people fought to find their way home. Part 1. The day the music stopped. The early 1960s, the world is a chessboard of Cold War anxieties, and Brazil is no exception. The nation was led by a populist president, João Goulart, known affectionately as Django. He was not a radical communist, but he was a reformer. Goulart championed what he called the reformers de base, or basic reforms. He spoke of giving land to landless peasants, of increasing workers' wages, and of nationalizing key industries to keep profits within Brazil. To his supporters, he was a hero of the people. To his opponents, he was a dangerous threat. Brazil's powerful landowning elites, conservative business leaders, and influential sectors of the Catholic Church saw his policies as the first step towards a socialist takeover. In Washington, the United States government watched with growing alarm, fearful of another Cuba emerging in their hemisphere. President Goulart spoke of his aims. Concrete measures to stimulate agricultural production, particularly of food staples, are eagerly awaited by all, in the interest of social peace in Brazil. But his words were twisted by his opponents. They painted a picture of communist chaos, of a nation on the brink of collapse. The slogan "Freedom is not red" began appearing on city walls. The climate of fear was palpable. The breaking point came on March 31, 1964, in a move meticulously planned by senior military commanders, with the quiet encouragement of the United States through a support mission codenamed Operation Brother Sam. Tanks rolled through the streets. It wasn't a bloody, protracted battle. It was a swift, decisive, and chillingly efficient takeover. President Goulart, realizing his position was untenable, fled into exile in Uruguay to avoid a civil war. By April 1st, democracy in Brazil was suspended. The military junta that seized power promised it was a temporary measure, a quick intervention to restore order and steer the nation away from the perceived communist threat before returning power to civilians. But this promise would prove to be hollow. Just over a week later, on April 9th, the regime issued its first major decree, Institutional Act No. 1, or AI-1. This wasn't a new constitution. It was something far more potent. It was a legal tool that allowed the military to rule above the Constitution. AI-1 granted the new president the power to remove elected officials from office, to fire civil servants at will, and to strip any citizen of their political rights for 10 years. It was the weaponization of law, allowing the regime to surgically remove its opposition without the inconvenience of democratic process. The military could now purge Congress of dissenters, neutralize political rivals, and ensure that no one could challenge its authority. The music of Brazilian democracy had not just been paused. The orchestra had been sent home, and a new, severe conductor had taken the stage. Part 2. The Brazilian Miracle. With political opposition silenced, the military regime turned its attention to its other promise, fixing the economy. Under Goulart, Brazil had been plagued by soaring inflation, nearing 100% annually. The generals, more adept at command than at economics, entrusted this monumental task to a team of brilliant, unelected civilian technocrats. Their leader was Antonio Delfim Neto, a man who would become the architect of a period of staggering growth known as the Milagre Econômico, the Brazilian miracle. From 1968 to 1973, Brazil's economy grew at an average rate of over 10% a year, peaking at an incredible 14% in 1973. To a world watching on, It seemed as if Brazil had found a secret formula for success. The government invested massively, pouring money into gigantic infrastructure projects that captured the national imagination. The Rio da Bridge, a marvel of engineering, connected to major cities. The Itapu Dam, built in partnership with Paraguay, would become the largest hydroelectric power plant in the world. And most ambitiously, there was the Trans-Amazonian Highway, a project of almost mythical proportions. It was designed to slice through the heart of the Amazon rainforest, connecting the remote, undeveloped regions of the country and encouraging settlement. These were the pharaonic projects, symbols of a new, powerful, and modern Brazil. State-owned companies like the oil giant Petrobras and the electricity utility Eletrobras expanded dramatically. To reduce the country's reliance on foreign oil, the government heavily promoted the ethanol industry. Industrial goods, which made up only 20% of Brazil's exports in 1968, skyrocketed to 57% by 1980. The country was transforming from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Lured by political stability and the promise of high returns, foreign capital and loans flooded into the country, financing this rapid expansion. Delfim Neto famously summed up his economic philosophy with a simple, powerful metaphor: the cake theory. He argued that you had to let the cake grow as large as possible before you could start cutting slices to distribute. In other words, national wealth had to be created first. Only then could the issue of sharing it be addressed, and the cake certainly grew. Brazil won the 1970 FIFA World Cup for the third time, a moment of immense national pride that the regime skillfully used to its advantage. The government slogan was everywhere: Brasil, amo, odeio Brazil. Love it or leave it. Too many, especially in the growing urban middle class, it felt like a golden age. The country was building, modernizing, and winning on the world stage. But there was a hidden, darker side to this miracle. The cake was growing, but it was being devoured by a select few. While corporate profits and the wealth of the elite soared, the regime intentionally suppressed wages for the working class to keep inflation down and exports cheap. Between 1960 and 1980, the share of the nation's total income held by the poorest 20% of Brazilians actually decreased from 3.9% to just 2.8%. The purchasing power of someone earning the minimum wage in 1974 was half of what it had been in 1960. The miracle was built on a foundation of deepening inequality. Furthermore, this rapid growth was dangerously dependent on two things: ever-increasing amounts of imported oil and massive borrowing from international lenders. When the global oil crisis hit in 1973, the miracle's foundations began to crack. The bill for all that progress started coming due, and by the end of the decade, Brazil would have the largest foreign debt in the world. And the cost wasn't just economic. The Trans-Amazonian Highway, a symbol of progress, was a catastrophe for the indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands it bisected. The project brought deforestation, disease, and violence. The National Truth Commission, established decades later, estimated that at least 8,350 indigenous people died as a direct or indirect result of the state's actions during this period of expansion. Their voices were not part of the miracle's triumphant chorus. The progress that was celebrated in the cities was, for many in the rainforest, a death sentence. Part 3. The years of lead. While the Brazilian miracle was being broadcast to the world, a very different reality was unfolding in the shadows. This dual existence of economic progress and political terror was no accident. They were two sides of the same coin. The regime believed that to achieve its vision of order and progress, it needed to eliminate any and all dissent. This period, from the late 1960s to the late 1970s, would become known as the Anos de Chumbo, the years of lead. The year 1968 was a turning point. Across the globe, from Paris to Prague, students were rising up. Brazil was no different. The March of the 100,000 saw a massive crowd take to the streets of Rio de Janeiro to protest the death of a student at the hands of the police. The regime, dominated by hardliners, saw this as a direct challenge to its authority. Their response was swift and absolute. On December 13, 1968, the government issued Institutional Act No. 5, or AI-5. If AI-1 had been a surgical knife, AI-5 was a sledgehammer. It is often called the coup within the coup. The moment the dictatorship shed any remaining pretense of constitutional legality, the powers of AI-5 were breathtaking. It gave the president the authority to shut down Congress and state legislatures indefinitely. It suspended the right of habeas corpus for political crimes, meaning anyone could be arrested and held without charge or legal recourse. It formalized censorship of the press, music, and the arts. It gave the government the power to intervene in state and local governments, fire judges, and strip anyone of their political rights. In essence, AI-5 placed the will of the president above any and all laws. The impact was immediate and chilling. Opposition politicians were arrested. Supreme Court justices were forced into retirement. A wave of fear washed over the country. The National Truth Commission later estimated that during the dictatorship, some 20,000 people were victims of torture, and 434 were confirmed killed or missing, their bodies never found. This wasn't just about targeting armed guerrillas. The repression reached into every corner of society. University professors were fired, union leaders were arrested, students were taken from their classrooms. The state perfected a system of psychological warfare, creating a climate where neighbors suspected neighbors, and silence became the safest form of expression. But even in the face of such overwhelming repression, the Brazilian spirit of creativity refused to be extinguished. It simply went underground, becoming a master of disguise. This was the era of cultural resistance, a cat-and-mouse game played with the state's censors. In newsrooms, editors found ingenious ways to signal the reality of censorship. When the censors killed a story, some newspapers would print recipes or nonsensical poetry in its place, a silent message to their readers. The most famous example came from Jornal do Brasil, the day after AI-5 was enacted. Unable to report the news freely, it ran a weather forecast that read, "Dark times, temperature, suffocating, the air is unbreathable." Musicians became the voice of this subtle rebellion. Artists like Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, who were both eventually arrested and exiled, used rich metaphors and allegory to outwit the censors. The most legendary of these was Chico Buarque. His song Chalice played on a double meaning. The word in Portuguese sounds identical to Calce, which means shut up. So when the chorus cried out for the singer to be passed the chalice, everyone knew the real message was a defiant scream against the order to be silent. This network of terror was not confined to Brazil's borders. The regime was a key player in Operation Condor, a clandestine and sinister alliance between the right-wing dictatorships of South America, with support from the United States, the intelligence services of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil collaborated to hunt down, kidnap, and eliminate political exiles across the continent. A leftist who had fled Brazil could be captured by Allied agents in Argentina and never be seen again. It was a continent-wide web of repression, and the Brazilian dictatorship was one of its most important spiders. Part 4. The Slow Thaw. No dictatorship lasts forever. By the late 1970s, the twin pillars of the Brazilian regime, economic success and political stability, were crumbling. The miracle had ended, sputtering out in a storm of oil price shocks, rampant inflation, and unsustainable foreign debt. At home, labor unions, once suppressed, began to re-emerge, staging massive strikes between 1978 and 1980 that challenged the regime's economic model. The government that had justified its existence on its ability to manage the economy was now failing. Sensing the shifting winds, a more moderate faction within the military, led by President Ernesto Geisel, began a process of abertura, a gradual political opening. This was not a surrender, but a carefully managed retreat. The goal was to control the transition back to democracy on their own terms, to ensure the military could return to the barracks without facing consequences for its time in power. A key step in this process was the 1979 amnesty law. It was a monumental and controversial piece of legislation. On the one hand, it was a moment of joyous reunion, as political prisoners were freed and exiles were allowed to return home. But the law was a double-edged sword. It granted amnesty not only to those who had opposed the regime, but also to the agents of the state who had been responsible for torture, disappearances, and killings. This decision created a legacy of impunity that Brazil continues to grapple with to this very day. The abertura was slow and cautious. The military restored direct elections for state governors in 1982, a major concession. But the biggest prize, the presidency, remained firmly under their control, decided by an indirect vote in a Congress they still heavily influenced. But the Brazilian people, having had a taste of political freedom, now wanted the whole meal. This pent-up desire exploded into one of the largest and most vibrant civic movements in modern history. It started with a constitutional amendment proposed by a congressman named Dante de Oliveira, calling for the return of direct presidential elections. The movement that grew around it had a simple, powerful name: Diradas, direct elections now. Beginning in 1983 and exploding in 1984, the movement was a spectacle of hope. It unified Brazilians from all walks of life. Opposition politicians, famous musicians, football stars, and millions of ordinary citizens marched side by side. The rallies were colossal. An estimated 1 million people flooded the streets of Rio de Janeiro. In São Paulo, the crowd swelled to over 1.7 million, a sea of yellow and green, the colors of the Brazilian flag reclaimed by the people. It was a national catharsis, a peaceful and joyous uprising demanding the most fundamental right in a democracy, the right to choose your own leader. All eyes turned to the capital. On April 25, 1984, for the congressional vote on the Dante de Oliveira amendment, the nation held its breath. The final tally came in. The amendment received 298 votes in favor, a clear majority, but it was not enough. To pass a constitutional amendment, a two-thirds supermajority was required. It had failed by just 22 votes. A wave of disappointment washed over the country. The great hope for a direct election that year was dashed, but the sheer scale of the Dictatorship movement had made the military's position untenable. They could no longer govern without the consent of the people. They had lost their legitimacy on the streets. An indirect presidential election was held the following year, in January 1985. The opposition, united in a democratic alliance, coalesced around the respected and popular politician, Tancredo Neves. In the Electoral College, he won a landslide victory, becoming the first civilian president-elect in over 2 decades. The dictatorship was finally over, but in a final, tragic twist of fate. Tancredo Neves, the man who was to lead Brazil back to democracy, fell gravely ill on the very eve of his inauguration. He would never take the oath of office. After a 38-day public battle with his illness, he passed away. And so it was his vice-presidential running mate Sarney, a former supporter of the military regime, who had switched sides, who would ultimately be sworn in as Brazil's first civilian president, tasked with healing the wounds of a generation. The transition was complete. In 1988, Brazil promulgated a new constitution, a progressive document often called the Citizen Constitution. It enshrined sweeping civil liberties, expanded voting rights, and recognized the rights of indigenous peoples, explicitly rejecting the authoritarian legacy of the recent past. Today, Brazil is a vibrant, if complex, democracy. Yet the shadows of the dictatorship linger. The 21 years of military rule left deep scars on the nation's soul. The economic miracle accelerated industrialization, but also entrenched vast social and economic inequalities that still plague the country. The amnesty law left a legacy of impunity, making it difficult to hold individuals accountable for past abuses and arguably contributing to ongoing problems of state violence. The relationship between civilian governments and the military remains a sensitive and often tense subject. The story of Brazil's forgotten dictatorship is a powerful reminder that progress is a complex and often contradictory idea. A nation's economy can soar while its freedoms are crushed. Skyscrapers can rise while human dignity is buried in unmarked graves. To remember this period is not to dwell on the past, but to understand the present. It is to recognize the fragility of democracy and the courage of those who fight for it. It is to ask a crucial question. What is the true price of progress? And what happens when a nation chooses to forget? The answers to those questions are not just part of Brazil's history. They are a lesson for the world.